everyone. So we are live with Justin, AB, and Tido. So my name is Kwang. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Plato. We are organizing these webinars that we call Community AMA, Community Ask Me Anything, every other week to every 3 weeks to learn from the best engineering and product leaders we know. And today we have Tido Carriero, who is CPO of Segments. Before we start, let me go through all the partners that made this Community AMA really successful, one of the best so far. So thanks to Amplitude Product Analytics for Business, thanks to Full Story Customer Experience Products, thanks to Product Board Product Management Products, as well as thanks to Segments that makes customer data simple. We made one of the most successful Community AMA ever. You are really a lot of people interested about that topic and really excited to launch it. A quick word about Plato before we start, before I introduce the panelists. So Plato, we are helping engineers and product leaders become better leaders. We do this through mentorship. So thanks to Plato, you can be connected, matched with the best mentors who are engineering and product leaders. Tido is one of them, and Tido has been here for the last 2 years, helping many engineering and product leaders around the world to become better and to better manage their team, to build better products, and hopefully to create a better impact in the world. So thank you, Tido, for all your time and all your dedication to Plato. You've been one of the greatest mentor. You don't know that, but you are one of the best mentor in the platform.
Very humbling.
I can tell you that today. With Plato, you can meet with 500 mentors coming from Segments, Slack, Facebook, Google, you name it. They are available to help. Enough about Plato. We are here with our three panelists. AB and Justin, I will let you introduce yourself really quick. And then we can let Tido Carriero introduce himself also a little bit as well. And then, so the main goal is to learn as much as we can in 45 minutes until 9:50 from Tido about this really important and really challenging topic on how to find product market fit. So thank you again. I will let AB and Justin introduce yourself.
Sure, I can start. I'm Abby. I'm a product manager at Amplitude. I joined Amplitude back in February, but before that, I was at Dropbox for about 3.5 years, where I was on the product growth team focusing on driving revenue growth for Dropbox Business.
And I'm Justin Dilley. I lead the product team here at FullStory. I've been at FullStory for about a year, just a little over a year. And before joining the fine folks at FullStory, I led the product mobile team at Home Depot. And then prior to that, a number of product management roles at Amazon.
Cool. I'm Tido. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm super excited to be here with Justin and Abby. I think Amplitude and FullStory are some of our very favorite partners on the platform. We've been partners with Amplitude for several years now, and our favorite product analytics tool for sure. And I think FullStory kind of came onto the Segment product team's radar in the last 6 to 12 months, and for sure the favorite new tool. So I'm super excited to be with both of you, and I'm hoping that you can answer some questions later as well, not just me. A little bit of background about me. I started my career in engineering at Facebook and spent about 3.5 years doing engineering at Facebook. Was an early member of the Facebook ads team, and then moved over to manage part of the Facebook pages team. After about 3.5 years, felt like the company had grown a ton. I had joined when it was about 400 people, and it was several thousand people by the time I left. Joined Dropbox when it was about 100 people total, and managed a chunk of the team called the product engineering team. Probably most proud of helping to start the Dropbox for Business product line there, which is an important piece of the Dropbox revenue line now, obviously. And then about 3.5 years ago, I joined Segment as the VP of Engineering and helped kind of build the early engineering team at Segment. And then in the last year or so, have also stepped into the CPO role, so leading product and design in addition to engineering. And I think when I was thinking about topics to talk about, I felt like I spent a lot of my career sort of at these incredibly successful companies, trying to basically something that had already found product market fit, and it was like trying to find like a new product market fit that would meaningfully grow the business. And I think we've just had a lot of success at that at Segment in the last year, which has been quite exciting. And I'm not trying to say we figured it all out, for sure not, but we shipped 2 new products last year, which together account for about 1/3 of our net new revenue, split kind of evenly across those two new products. One was called Personas, which is a little bit more of a vision-led product, and then the other called Protocols, which is much more of a like, what's the customer's biggest problem, and just kind of keep asking them about that problem. And then we found a solution, and the solution was a very valuable solution. So we shipped Personas back in May of last year, and then Protocols in September of last year. So really exciting. I think we've started to get a little bit of a formula, and I can imagine if you guys are at all like me earlier in my career, I was just like really wondering how to get this sort of new product market fit, especially when you already have something that's successful. Like, how do you get something additive? And I think we have some cool thoughts along those lines that I'm happy to share stories around that. But that was kind of why I chose the theme of finding product market fit. And I think particularly finding product market fit when you've already found some product market fit is an interesting topic, and a little bit different than some of the things we've talked about in the past. So with that, I will stop my intro and open up the floor for questions from Justin and Abby and everyone else.
Just thank you, Tido, for the intro. Abby, Justin, just before we start, I forgot to mention that Zoom has an amazing feature named Q&A on the bottom. So if you click on the tab named Q&A, this is where we are going to take questions from the audience on the second part. So I see that there is a lot of activity in the chat. So we won't be able to read the questions that come in chat. We will be able to read the questions come from the tab named Q&A. So if you have questions, please and ask them there. And in the second part, about half of the time, we are going to answer questions from you all. So that's Abby, Justin, your turn.
Tido, I'll kick us off here. You mentioned that one of the products you launched was more vision driven and the other one was more customer problem driven. How do you think about balancing the priority of those two things in terms of like investing your product team's resources in what was probably like a fairly substantial amount of work for you guys?
Yeah. So maybe a little bit of grounding of just like sort of how much investment we were making in each of them. I think so Personas was the more vision-led one. That was probably a solid 6 or 12 months of customer discovery, and that was like a much heavier kind of infrastructure investment we were making as well. So we've always had kind of a streaming data pipeline. So we had never really stored state about the user, and so Personas is a whole piece of infrastructure that has an identity resolution component that stitches together identities from numerous different sources, stores state of profiles, and then has a bunch of fairly advanced computation that you can do on top of that state. So it was 3 heavy infrastructure components. That investment was probably about 4 or so engineers for about a year. Out of a team at the time, we probably had about 50 total engineers. So call it 10%. Obviously, a designer, a couple product managers were involved in the early days. So pretty heavy investment. 10% of the overall kind of company. I think similarly on the protocols, it was a similar investment. The company was a little bit bigger, so it was 3 or 4 people. That one was really led by a product designer and a PM in the early days, and then engineers came in a little bit later there. But yeah, again, so roughly 10% for these new bets. I don't know that I have like a perfect answer for the real question here, which is portfolio allocation. I think some of it is really kind of seeing how opportunities develop, and I think I've liked to have kind of a couple of bets going on each year. I think you really want to invest a good 70% in your core business. And I think that's the thing everyone forgets is like the core business is really important. and even though it's growing, it is not perfect and is not without flaws. And it's really tempting to have like 10 different bets going on, each of 10% that are kind of building new things. But we like to have 2 or maybe 3 like kind of really pointed specific bets each year. I like to do one a little bit more vision led, just in the sense that I think kind of if you want to get somewhere crazy different in 2 or 3 years and you have this bigger vision, I think the win for the customer problem-led one will be a little bit more incremental in nature. And we found that it's a little bit more of an easy kind of go-to-market motion. And it's just like a very natural fit. And it's like, thank you from customers. And the vision one takes like a little bit more selling and kind of showing the customer the future. So it's a little bit more challenging from a go-to-market perspective, but it also feels like our most powerful feature. And I think for those that really get Segment, the kinds of things they're able to build on personas is truly inspiring. And so I think it's a little bit of a mix. But yeah, I would say my framing in my mind is like 2 or 3 bets per year. Those bets should be, about 10% of your end product design resources, and yeah, maybe 1 vision led and 2 customer problem led is probably roughly what it should be. But I really don't approach it from a like portfolio allocation. This is what's going to happen perspective. It's actually much more of a where are the most interesting ideas, and these most interesting ideas can come from designers, tech leads, PM. I mean, they come from all over the place as well. And I view my job as more of like, how do I spot those ideas and kind of prop up those ideas when we have that customer research or we have that analytical insight that tells us that we really should be doing this. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. And I mean, ultimately, how do you filter like all of those great ideas that are either vision or problem specific? Like, what's the process? I'm assuming there's no shortage of great ideas to filter through. At least that's been my experience in product for the most part. It's really like trying to make the hard decisions of which ones are the most valuable or the most important.
Yeah, I definitely. We certainly have no shortage of great ideas, and I think that's like the constant problem. I think there's like great ideas coming from the go-to-market team. That could be the sales team. That could be the success team. There's great ideas coming from the engineers, from the designers, from from the product team itself. Like great ideas are all over. I actually try to do as little filtering myself as possible. I really don't view that as my role. I think that is the role of like a great PM, is really kind of quarterbacking and filtering. And so we definitely have light kind of product review type processes where, a PM gets really excited about an idea and puts together like a product requirements doc and has a really strong gut feeling, but we have some structure in there to kind of really encourage like, what about the market opportunity is interesting? What qualitative insights do we have from customers? What quantitative insights do we have? And really trying to have a structure that forces a product manager or whoever's putting together this sort of product pitch, you can think of it as, to really think through in a structured way what that opportunity looks like. But I think once we do that, usually it's actually pretty clear to the PM between all of the different ideas, which idea is like the idea that's like most exciting to go really invest in building like a proper kind of product pitch doc. And then I find that most of the actual product reviews are more like rubber stamp meetings. It was like all of the work to get there and kind of present the thing. That is the thing that was actually hard. The decision itself ends up being much easier. This is the same experience I have when I prepare, spend a lot of time preparing board notes for our board of directors. I think 90% of the value is actually in that exercise of collecting all of my thoughts and synthesizing them down into something that I can really explain to an outside party. And we have an amazing board of directors, but they're a lot less close to the problem than I am. But it's that act of preparing all of it in a structured way, like really a way that forces you to think through what those opportunities are. That's the piece that I think really ends up providing the value.
Yeah, makes sense.
You mentioned that, good ideas can come from anywhere, and that's definitely true. How do you build a culture where people from all different types of roles, not just PMs, feel comfortable raising those ideas and kind of bringing them to the table and supporting them, especially coming from an engineering background? I'm curious how you kind of encourage that.
Yeah, I think I'm a little biased because I was always like the product engineer in the room who like really wanted to be a PM, but like also wanted to be an engineer. So I was like, many ideas come from I think actually the thing I've learned the most is just how strategic design can be, especially in this early part of the process. And I think I didn't have sort of that more enlightened view earlier in my career, but designers really are like amazing at customer research. And I think like in that early stages, I think it's tempting as a PM to just kind of like run with this thing. And we actually just hired our first official head of user research design, a woman named Hannah, who's amazing. And she is just like so next level at actually conducting unbiased interviews and like turning those into foundational insights. And, you know, our PM team is great. I think we all like a little bit have an agenda in our minds when we're trying to like ask some questions about like validating some features we have. And I think like if you can really get a designer in the mix early to really conduct unbiased kind of experiments, I think that can be really cool. I have a couple of actually more specific stories. I might flip to a visual here about early days protocols. I think there's two interesting stories. One is an idea that came from an engineer, and one is an idea that came from a designer. So I will flip to that in a second, but I'm curious, or I'm excited to describe a little bit what protocols does. Protocols basically, you can think of it as, we found that a lot of companies don't treat their customer data tracking systems the same way they would treat a production system, and it's this business critical system. All of this kind of back-end process or all of this analytical insight, all of these things sort of depend on this tracking being in place and working. But most companies don't actually treat the problem as a business critical system. And this was the problem-led or the customer problem-led product. We were basically finding that the number one problem across pretty much all customers, even super happy customers, was data quality. People were saying like, I love Segment, data quality is still a challenge, or I couldn't really get into Segment because data quality is such a challenge. And so we really built a set of tools to kind of help combat the problems of data quality. And so in the very early days, our product designer named Kat, she and Niels were really doing a lot of this early customer validation. And Kat actually built some very janky manual prototypes just to validate the ideas. And I think sort of the whole idea of early stage product development is you want to validate ideas as cheaply as possible. And so I'll just show quickly, I'm going to flip over to my screen, show quickly what Kat built. So we had been talking to a customer and they had actually built something that looked something like this internally. So this is like events that they were tracking, application installed, application opened, home screen viewed, product searched, etc. And then the properties that each of these events was supposed to have. And then for each source, basically whether or not the events were coming through. And they had built something like this. Kat cleaned it up and made, this is just in Google Sheets, made something that looked like this. And the customer got super excited and was like, this is exactly what we need. And you know, we showed it to a couple more customers. And then that sort of very early stage validation, which is obviously a lot cheaper to build something that looks like this. This might be like an hour to build, which Kat kind of brilliantly built, turns into like actually a production screen. This is like a screenshot taken like of what the product ended up looking like. And just a very close, almost like facsimile of like the earlier thing we had. And I think this is like a good example of just sort of someone who's really awesome at customer research, getting in there and like being like, okay, well, what's the cheapest way I could just like show someone something and like see if they like it, and then that turns into this really awesome kind of production screen. You know, many months later, obviously, lots of iterations later. But I was just kind of tickled like how similar basically that first thing and that second thing end up being if you do the customer research right. The other story. I don't think I have a visual for this one, but the other story is we have a feature called Typewriter, which is basically a type checker. So once you enter your schema of the data you want to collect, so application installed is like an event name. We were kind of hearing from one of our customers, and this was a case where one of our engineers was there with Niels, our PM, who is leading this. And they were saying like, oh, but the problem actually is that like when you're actually instrumenting the event, you want the ability to like make sure that the event gets instrumented correctly at the code level. And we're like, oh, well, we don't really have we're not going to go build like a code editor for this. And Gurdas, who is our engineer on the team, basically started like thinking about this problem and was kind of working directly with the customer here, and realized that we could actually, there are extensions to these code editors, and basically couldn't sleep that night, hacked out some deep into the night this thing that we called typewriter that's now open source. If you search for segment typewriter, you should be able to find it. And it's basically, actually, I have it up on my screen. Let me just reshare my screen. It basically plugs into a code editor and does this very thing. So when someone is actually typing analytics doing the implementation of segment, they get this type ahead. And so we actually build that from the spec that sort of the spec that they have put into segment, and type analytics and you have the whole sort of event hierarchy right there. And if you actually make a mistake, it will red underline and it won't compile under certain rules. And so it's a very cool thing. And I don't think we would have made that connection had an engineer not been in the room right there and been like, wait a minute, maybe this is possible, because I know like pretty much all editors are extensible in this way. Like, it wasn't even something that, you know, I knew or the PM knew, like only this engineer knew it, but he had to be kind of connected directly to the customer. And so I think, I know it's not like a super satisfying answer, but I think the answer, like, you just need to be exposed to the customers, and you need to show up with all parties exposed to the customers. I think design brings this incredible, like, unbiased interview sort of vibe. I think engineers, especially if you're building developer tooling, bring an incredible, like, knowledge of the customer vibe. It's also incredibly inspiring for engineering teams to hear directly from the customer about problems. You can hear through someone, and that's like, you know, 3 out of 10 interesting, or you can like watch a customer suffer through this, and that's like 10 out of 10 frustrating and interesting, and really motivating. So I think it's like having everyone show up. I think some of the best ideas from protocols came from places outside of product, and for sure our product leader Niels here like did an absolutely phenomenal job leading this area. But I think, you know, he always says, you know, when I'm meeting with him, like, he's happiest when he's kind of fallen back into the background, because like everyone is just like crushing it and coming up with ideas and moving things forward. If that makes sense.
Yeah. One follow-up question on that. You showed sort of the original protocols, that spreadsheet sort of view that ultimately came the productized version of it. How did you kind of find the place where you found that kind of product market fit with that product, and knew maybe, you know, you always want to be continuously iterating, but you had something that was good enough to kind of move on to the next thing, sort of? What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Protocols was an interesting one. So we knew data quality was like the thing, and we kept getting asked about data quality, and we were like, you know, very, very like, okay, data quality, data quality, data quality. We actually had 3 fairly different prototypes. I think the one I showed you that Kat built here was the one that ended up winning. But there were actually 2 that fast failed, and they didn't fast fail because of any sort of failure on our part, but I think it's interesting to talk about this. So one was, we had this theory that anomaly detection was actually the biggest thing. And so basically if you had this event that was flowing in and then that like fell off a cliff, we could detect that. And that does happen. Like, you basically get sort of events accidentally unimplemented. That actually happened internally at Segment, and I have a horror story about millions of dollars of lost pipeline from that, but I'll save that for a little bit later. But I think that that was like one, is like anomaly detection, and the other, so we built a prototype there. It was a fully functional prototype. Oh, I remember the other. The other was transformation. So it was actually taking the event name and transforming it to a different event name, which would help with like a schema migration. For instance, if you had like your old schema, like all the event names were underscores, and then you wanted to change them to like title case event names, it's actually very hard to perform one of those migrations, especially if you have client-side devices in the wild, like a mobile, like an iOS app. You just never can like 100% update that iOS app. And so you actually need something on the server side to help with those migrations. Ultimately, basically, we just felt a lot less pull for anomaly detection. We had it set up for, I don't know, 10, 20 customers. We had some basic transformations things. As we got into transformations, we built some basic infrastructure. We realized that the requirements were actually just a much bigger scope to get to like an MVP of something that was interesting. We just had a lot more infrastructure work to do it. We did conclude that one's valuable. Actually, transformations ended up just basically being pushed out 6 months. It's on our Q2 roadmap, so we're working on it right now, which is cool. It just like wasn't part of that sort of initial product. And then Anomaly Detection, we realized it was really hard to shut that one down, because like you tell yourself like, okay, well, I'm just going to pick the winner of these 3 prototypes, but then you spend a lot of time on each of the prototypes. But we did ultimately realize that there are other companies that really do anomaly detection much better than us. Companies like Datadog, which really are fully in the monitoring space. And so we actually have a partnership coming with Datadog where we'll just send them all of the event volumes. They just showed us a demo of it. It's super cool. We send them all the event volumes, and then they can actually do triggering, and you can do all of your kind of fancy alerting based on basically different thresholds in Datadog that you set up. And they have a very advanced anomaly detection engine, because like they're doing that all the time with more infrastructure metrics. So basically the 2 other prototypes like were good ideas. I think in retrospect, now that we're about a year later from building all these prototypes, they were actually both worth the time, and they both made it into like later roadmap. But we did actually throw both of them out, and it was the pull on Kat's spreadsheet here, among sort of other things, that really convinced us that we had something here. Actually, there was one other sort of memorable customer visit. So Kat, our designer, Niels, our PM, and then DSJ, our eng manager, went down to Fox on site and actually like shadowed their QA engineers for a day to see how they were QAing the data tracking. And that was a super interesting visit, because they have to test on so many different devices. And so it's totally reasonable. Like, this is super high stakes production system for them. I don't think they're doing anything crazy, but it was just like, oh, wow, we can like really help them with some more baseline unit testing, just do all of this testing across all of these devices. So it was a combination between the poll we saw on the spreadsheet being really interesting, along with like that on-sites like that Fox on-site, where it's like, okay, there is like real opportunity here. And, you know, I think, again, the recipe is having engineering, product, and design show up together and do this thing together. It's a team effort. It's not like PM's leading the way. It's not, you know, it's not any one function leading the way.
And Tido, like you mentioned before, that each of these products are making about 1/3 of your net new revenue.
So together they're making about 1/3. So each about 15%. Yeah.
Is that how you guys think about like successful product launches in terms of like generating new business? Are there other things you guys look at to say like, oh yeah, we really nailed it with personas, or boy, we still have a bit of work to go to achieve the success criteria that we established?
Yeah, so I think it all depends on the success criteria you establish upfront. By no means are all of the things we try to do like completely revenue driven. We do a lot of product initiatives where there are different North Star success metrics with both sort of personas and protocols. The criteria we had set up when we started it was like, hey, we'd really like to increase sort of average contract value for ourselves. So it's interesting to look at the total revenue. I think the even more interesting numbers is just like how much we can upsell, sort of like if a contract is like $100,000 a year, like how much can we sort of attach from the attach, both the attach rate and the attach amount, how much can we lift that kind of ACV up? And so that was kind of thematically one of the things we were interested in doing as a business last year. So that is ultimately, and rather than revenue of the product, it was like attach rate and then sort of attach amount. Those were like the metrics we were looking at really closely as sort of the North Star metrics of success. I think that's actually a great point. Some of the other protocols features we considered adding, which we are, you know, adding today, anomaly detection and this sort of transformations mappings feature, they also just felt like things that we wanted to include as part of the core platform. And so things that we felt like should be part of the router and not necessarily something that is like a totally different SKU. And whereas this sort of full kind of tracking schema and automated QA thing felt much more appropriate as a separate item. And so it was actually part of that North Star metric that also helped guide us between the 3 prototypes. And we did like re-ask ourselves the question when we had the 3 prototypes, like, are we sure that this is the metric we want to drive? And at the time we said, yeah, that is like the metric we want to drive this year. But we have numerous other product things that are ongoing where the North Star metric is not at all about revenue. It just happened to be for these 2.
And when you mentioned North Star metric, I mean, do you guys have a variety of North Star metrics that you're tracking depending on the product, or is there like ultimately one or a small handful that you're like, these really are what we're tacking to as a product team?
Yeah, not something we've fully figured out for sure.
Yeah.
I'd actually love to hear Abby's answer. I've heard a lot about interesting North Star metrics at Amplitude. I'll share quickly on our side, and don't mean to put you on the spot, Abby, if you don't want to answer this, but I think on our side, we kind of think of each team as having kind of like a headline mission for the year. And so like, one kind of metric that they're really responsible for, like this is the investment the business has made in sort of moving this metric. Some of those are add-on revenue. Actually, because of our success last year, we've taken the foot off the gas quite a bit on add-on revenue. We're reinvesting much more into more organic growthy type metrics, and really just making the connections product, which is our core product, feel like a lot more complete. So a little bit more like NPS-y and sort of expansion type metrics rather than like sort of attach revenue type metrics. And that's just like because our business kind of got this big injection of this new revenue source last year. And so now we're kind of tipping things in a slightly different direction. But yeah, I would say each team has like one headline kind of North Star metric, and it's not nearly as clean as I'm describing right now. So don't worry if it's not clean internally at your companies either. But yeah, that is kind of what we aspire to do. I think each team kind of knowing what its mission is and making sure that those missions don't overlap or collide with other teams is a super important thing to do. And I think of that part as actually the super important part of my job. I don't think of like filtering all of the different ideas. Certainly happy to coach PMs or coach whoever on these things, but I really think of the PMs as owning that. They're really the people figuring out how to sort of make this metric come true over the course of a year. But I'd be curious, I know Amplitude's thought a lot about North Star product metrics.
Yeah.
I heard a talk from one of your designers on it.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, definitely thinking a lot about North Star metrics. We actually just revised our North Star metric this year. It was previously kind of weekly querying users. So how often were people querying? And we've actually moved to weekly learning users. So really the measurement of not just how often are people querying, but how are those learnings, those queries being distributed across an org, because we really believe that connects more with both the customer and business value. So that's been a really big shift for us, and kind of similar to what you said, Tido, in terms of how that North Star metric kind of then ladders to individual teams, is we try to think about for each of our kind of pods or pillars that we have within the product org, picking North Star metrics for those teams that really ladder up to that broader company North Star metric. So an individual pod or team of, PM, engineer, designer may have their own North Star, but ultimately we want to be picking something that's bringing it up to that weekly learning user metric at the top level, so that we're kind of all moving towards that one product vision. But similar to what you said, how you get there is really up to the team to determine. But having that North Star metric and really taking quite a bit of time when a team is kicking off to really make sure that we believe that metric signals value and connects to that broader North Star is a really important exercise that we go through every time we launch any new team or any new pod that's working on a customer problem.
Abby, I'm curious why you guys changed like your North Star metric, like what the general process. I imagine that was probably a pretty big decision.
Yeah, it was. And it's really actually changed a lot of the ways that we operate as a product team as well. I think one of the biggest reasons that we changed was really trying to measure how customer value can spread throughout an organization and not just be individual. So we have a core hypothesis that analytics is a team sport. So sharing the learnings that you have from an analysis can really help an organization and propel it forward. But if we really truly believe that to be true, then we should have a metric that aligns to it, rather than a metric that aligns to an individual analyst going off in a corner and developing some work. We want to really be measuring the breadth of that learning and how it's actually having an organizational impact. So we made a strategic shift to realign to that weekly learning user metric. And it's really changed the way even, our product team is structured and the goals that we're going after. We're constantly asking ourselves, is the work we're doing laddering up to that WLU metric? And it's really been a positive shift for pretty much every person across the company and how they work.
It's exciting.
Yeah.
Cool. Should we open up the questions to the Q&A panel? What do you guys think? Any other questions before we do that? Okay, cool. Let's do it.
One question that I see here, which actually aligns to a question I had as well, was Peter is asking how you do product discovery in different companies. I was specifically curious myself around when you talked about vision-led, a vision-led kind of product, how you thought about customer discovery or product discovery for that vision-led initiative. Could you talk a little bit about kind of what that looks like?
Yeah. I think the honest answer is we thought about it a little bit late. I think so it had definitely started with a sort of deeply rooted idea. So we're collecting all of this customer data. That's what Segment does, is all of these interactions. Think of it as like a scaled version of, sorry, I think this background's a little bit important to talk about what the vision was. Basically, we're collecting all of these customer touch points across all different channels. It's kind of a scaled version of CRM. 20 years ago, you would just sort of have your account team like write down everything they know about this account in the CRM, and that was kind of enough to sort of understand enough about the customer. But today, so much is happening sort of self-service. It's happening over web, iOS, Android apps. It's happening over email channels. It's happening over ads channels. And so you actually kind of need to know this whole history of like all of the things leading up to this moment where you're trying to make a sale to the customer, or you're trying to, get them to renew for a year or whatever it is. And sort of without that historical sort of knowledge base all in one place, it's very hard to always kind of do the next right thing for the customer. If you don't know that you're trying to upsell a customer, but they're having this incredibly like negative support interaction right now, like you're going to like go send a bill and put it on their desk at exactly the wrong time. Those kinds of things can happen. But Segment had always just been this like data router. So we had been stateless. So we just kind of collect this data, we transform it, we'll send it to Amplitude, we'll send it to Full Story, we'll send it to BigQuery, whatever tools in the marketing automation analytics space, et cetera. But we had never kind of added this notion of state. And obviously every marketer, every product manager, most people using this data actually want to think of it not as a bunch of raw transactional events, but like a set of customers who sort of have these profiles. And I think we sort of understood that was like the end game goal. I mean, there's this incredibly cliche things like the single view of the customer, the 360-degree view of the customer, the complete customer journey. There's all these phrases that have been like marketing's holy grail for 30 years at this point. So I think we certainly had a whole bunch of qualitative analysis done that this was like sort of at a higher level abstraction, this was really like the right theme to be after. And I think the vision was grounded in quite a bit of like very good research that had happened. I think where we honestly kind of fell down for a little while in the early days is I think we were fairly opinionated and just like, okay, well, there's kind of three pieces of infrastructure we need to build. We need to build identity resolution. We need to build the sort of profile store, and then we need to build this compute engine on top of it. It's actually interesting. Personas to the end customer actually looks much more like the compute engine. We advertise it as like ability to compute traits and compute audiences. And so like a lot of those first two things were important, but I think we probably could have done it in a slightly more iterative way. I think we could have gotten to computed traits and audiences like a bit faster. It's a little bit hard without the data model of stitching together the customer. And I do think what we set up is actually probably right for the long-term, like 3 to 5 year outlook. We have the right infrastructure to build like a whole bunch more. But I do think we weren't, like the product really started to converge after the infrastructure was kind of in decent shape and we were starting to like really show it to customers. And I think some of our early ideas of like the things that we thought customers were going to do with it were maybe 20 degrees off. And so we just kind of had to adjust. But that was like the moment that it felt like things really started to click, was we got into this sort of like rapid state where we were, what we do when we get into an early customer beta is we just have Slack channels. And so we'll just set up Slack channels with every single customer who's trying this thing, and really kind of like figure out if they're using it, what they like, what they don't like, if they're not using it, why they didn't turn it on. But it's really a pretty high touch thing. So I think for us, for personas, there was like maybe this somewhat awkward like 3 to 6 month period where we were building infrastructure, which I do think ended up being the right infrastructure, but we weren't getting enough of those customer interactions. And that was a scary time. I still like think back and I'm like, that was a scary time. maybe it was the right thing. I mean, certainly the product's doing really well. I think the foundation's incredibly strong for a lot more features. But I do wish we had been in Slack channels a couple months earlier. And I think if I could redo the whole thing, we would have figured out a way to do so. Whereas I think when we built protocols, I mean, it was just always like the most embarrassing thing. Don't worry about it. See if it like resonates with the customer. And I think that that product market fit process felt a little bit faster to me, which was awesome. I do think like the more iterative customer problem led things like just lend themselves a little bit more to that as well. So I'm not sure it's exactly a fair comparison, but I do think it's an interesting contrast between the two. You do need to take a leap of faith. I think when you take that leap of faith, you need to know how much runway that leap of faith has. And I think with personas, we might have gotten a little bit closer to that runway than we usually talk about publicly.
Looks like, I mean, there's a bunch of questions in here about like team design and how you scale the team. Might be something to poke on for the audience here.
Sure. I think it's funny. There's this like desire, like when we like start a new initiative and we're like, this is a really important initiative for the company. There's this desire to like sort of have like just a whole bunch of people kind of get together and like start working on this thing. We found, so like when we made like platform one of our really big themes this year, and so we're really opening up the sort of who can build integrations on Segment. Historically, we've built and maintained pretty much all of the integrations. We opened up the platform about a month ago, and we have about 40 new integrations which were built by partners, which is super exciting for us. Anyway, that was like a big kind of strategic goal we set at the beginning of the year. And we had this moment where like every team wanted to like get in and help this effort. And I think it makes sense, right? Like you declare as a company that one of your strategic goals that you're going to spend 10% of resources on is platform. And then suddenly you're like 10% of, 350 people, that's 35 people who now are ready to like come work on platform. And that's actually not helpful. And I think what we realize is there's a core team of people that we needed to sort of get this sort of 0 to 1 project off the ground. And it was a couple of engineers, a product manager, and someone from our partnerships team. And that was like the critical path at the beginning to just sort of like figure out how to get partners like willing to do the work to build an integration on our platform. And turned out there was a lot of demand, and there was some tools that were a little bit lacking that we needed to go build. But we got actually a very small team, really a team of about 4 people, like getting that thing from 0 to 1. And now that like it's going, there's like a lot more room to kind of like bring in. We've had some awesome like PMM support. We had some awesome like further partnership support. We've like realized that to kind of bet bigger, we might need to do some more infrastructure work. So we're starting to like kind of build more people into the team. But I would say we are scaling kind of just in time. It's like when the person leading that project is like, okay, like I'm ready to spin up this bet. I have a very clear like point of view on exactly what needs to get built. And like, this is the thing I want to get built. Like we will then go fund that and bring that resource into the team. And it's actually been quite unhelpful just being like, okay, like here's 35 people, like go figure out how to make this thing useful, or 20 people or whatever the number is. And really starting, I think Amazon talks a lot about these like 2 pizza teams and like starting incredibly lean. But yeah, every time we've started like at the 0 to 1 phase with like a fatter team than it needs to be, somehow like twice as many engineers like slows down the team. And it's not that anyone's like a bad engineer or doing anything wrong. It's just like the dynamics change quite a bit when you are like a really lean team just like running like crazy versus like a much larger team where everyone's like trying to figure out how they can like contribute, and then there's like a lot of process overhead and things. So yeah, I think my one piece of advice here would be like start as lean as possible. Even if you are willing as a company to invest a lot more, start with a super lean team and kind of like gradually pull in resources as you have incredibly clear sort of work for those additional resources. Don't like put a bunch of resources and look for work for them to do, because it's just a sort of sad state to be in.
Yeah, that resonates with me. We definitely always, whenever we're spinning up a team, are thinking about what's the smallest number of people that you could basically have on that team to get to the first learning is kind of the benchmark that we use. So what's the smallest number of people to get to the first learning the fastest, and then kind of keep answering that question for yourself as you go.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that's our recipe as well. Well stated, I think.
Yeah, and I definitely come from the Amazon mind of the two pizza team being a way to push both like decision making down in the organization as close to the people that are as close to the work as possible. And so I think when you organize around these small teams, they can move quicker. They're faster to make these decisions. It's better to have them make these decisions. So trying to organize your general product team in a way that is small and nimble and decentralized, and try and reduce, it's something you mentioned actually, Tido, reduce kind of the overlap in missions among the teams is also super important. So you can kind of run in parallel and try and get as much value out there for customers as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. When you have overlap in missions or kind of competing priorities, you sort of start to hit the alignment and just things that are processes that need to run at larger companies, but they're super, super, super expensive. And so like the more you can just avoid those super expensive processes, like you can spend a day aligning, or you can build like a meaningful new feature in a day. And so like, obviously the more we can do the latter, the better off we are.
Yeah.
One other question I'm seeing here is from Angela, talking about kind of going from the hyper growth stage of scaling an org, moving from the 0 to 1 to kind of that 1 to N. And maybe if you have some perspective on the differences in mindset shift that occurs when you go kind of from that 0 to 1 onto that 1 to N. And also specifically, should PMs continue to build MVPs at that stage?
Yeah, maybe I'll talk a little bit about the personas team. So we're coming up on a year of being in general availability, and we have some renewals now. And we're like, oh, we've never had renewals. We were kind of building like a lot of just sort of MVP stuff, but renewals, like you suddenly ask yourself questions like, have I onboarded all of my customers properly, and like, are they getting value? I mean, obviously we were asking these questions earlier too, but I think there's this sort of intense moment where you really kind of ask a bunch of these questions. And so yeah, it's been an interesting shift. Certainly we've found that a couple engineers like need to help scale personas. We've sold to some much larger customers than we initially sold to on day one of the GA, which is super exciting for us, but like that comes with additional sort of infrastructure load. And so I would say the subtle shift has been like, okay, yeah, maybe the personas eng team is still pretty small. It's still maybe 5 or 6 engineers, something like that. So we've started to realize like, okay, actually maybe 2 engineers really are going to spend pretty much all of their time scaling these systems. And in particular, we have one customer who sends live data from cricket matches in India. And so that will come in as a huge spike in the middle of the night for us about 3 a.m. And so like those systems just need to scale to meet sort of some of those demand and make sure that we're still processing all of that data in real time. So you start getting projects that look like those scaling projects. But I would say, yeah, the ethos of that team and like what they are doing is very much like, okay, we've now like made it to this part of our product success. Like, what is the next journey that gets us the step change up? And I certainly think at least half of that team, and we're hoping to get, we're investing more in that team, so hoping to get 2/3, 3/4 of that team still building kind of new MVPs and still kind of pushing things forward. But yeah, there will be projects like really scaling the system to meet sort of new levels of load, and we'll carve off sub teams to go do that. And those are projects that are important. Those are not projects you can just like completely forget, because then you'll have an incredibly leaky bucket, because all of these bigger customers who came on like will not use this product that is not reliable. So yeah, I think there's new projects that come about, but the more you can keep the culture of the MVP and the culture of that 0 to 1, I think the better off you are. You just need to make sure that you're balancing that with real scaling projects and real, I think we had some personas as a fairly expensive piece of infrastructure to operate. So we had some real cost reduction projects. We had some real reliability and scaling projects that we've been doing. But we still run those projects actually fairly similarly to how we run the MVP ones. They're just like separate resources, and they are things you need to account for.
And I would just emphasize kind of on the building the MVP. That's something we never stop doing at Amplitude, at least. Kind of, we really live by that skateboard, car, scooter, et cetera, mentality of what is the kind of the least amount of effort that you can get out there. So kind of going back to that spreadsheet, figuring out what kind of, response from your customers you're going to get back from there and continue to iterate on. So I think MVPs are relevant at any stage of the product development process.
Yeah, and the best teams are always doing MVPs, and that's just like how we think about sort of new feature development and trying to scale the feeling of Hack Week much more than once or twice a year to like how can we be doing that every month, every week. That is when folks are at their most creative, when they're at their most empowered, and I think that's like a huge thing that we've been working on at Segment is trying to scale that feeling as much as possible. Cool. I think we're. Are we running up on time, or should we do one more question?
Maybe one more.
One more, yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Why don't you cherry pick one, Tido, if you can? We've been
okay. I haven't been reading them a ton, so if there's something that jumps out, what's an interesting one? Talk about how much time our engineers, PMs, and designers are spending with customers each week. I love that one. So I think the answer should be a lot for sure. I think there's different phases of a project, and so I might actually call out kind of I think we've been talking a little bit about them: the 0 to 1 phase, the sort of 1 to 100 phase, and then I guess products sometimes hit a terminal phase. We've never had one hit a terminal phase at Segment, so I don't know what that one looks like. I think during that 0 to 1 phase, I mean, all the time. I think Abby mentioned this a little bit, but just like what is the fastest way you can get to the next learning, the next insight? Sometimes that's a designer putting together what feels like a janky spreadsheet in a Google Sheets, but it's actually like a huge breakthrough in figuring out what folks want. Sometimes you need to actually write some code to validate an idea. That's okay, but you should be asking yourselves like how can I get this code done in 3 days? Not like how can I build a great system that's going to work for 3 to 6 months. And so in that sort of validation phase, in that 0 to 1 phase, you should be talking to customers like all the time. Ideally, many customers a day or like if you aren't talking to customers today, it's like, okay, well, I was spending 48 hours building this prototype so I can show it to a customer on like Friday. I think that's very much the mindset. I think when you do get into that 1 to 100 phase, it depends a little bit more on the types of projects. I think for the folks that are scaling the system for this, customer who's sending like huge spikes of traffic, it's not as important that we don't need to check in and say like, hey, like, we're still working on this. Any other thoughts? Like, it's just not, there's not like a meaningful learning there. But even those teams, as I mentioned, are probably still in the, half the team is in the 0 to 1 phase. So that half the team that's in the 0 to 1 phase, it's usually the designer, that's usually, half the eng team, that's usually the PM are still talking to customers all the time. And I think each customer sort of meeting or feedback in Slack is just like a huge opportunity for learning. And I think the pace at which you can show them a new thing and then get some kind of response back, like that pace it turns into your product velocity and your company's velocity. And so I think just the faster you can do that, the better when you're in that early phase.
All right. It was too short, but it was really insightful. Thank you so much, the three of you, for your time. And it was a really interesting discussion. I learned a lot. Let me share some of my learning, maybe in 30 seconds. So learning number one, a big part of the value comes from collecting your thoughts and synthesizing it. That's interesting, Tido. The metrics is not always about revenue. Each product has a different North Star. Abby, have a North Star that is tied to value for the customer and decline it to all the teams. Build an infrastructure to be able to iterate for the next 3 years, maybe. More people doesn't necessarily help. From 0 to 1, stay as lean as possible. Ask yourself what is the minimum number of people to build this MVP. Engineers should spend a lot of time, especially from the 0 to 1 phase. So many other learning, obviously, from this session. We are going to write a blog post to synthesize all of this. But what I wanted to share is obviously many learnings from this session, but also many learnings that we could have from other sessions. So just so everyone knows, Tido is a mentor in the platform, and you could be mentored by Plato in one-on-one session, in group session, and have more learning from here. There are 28 questions unanswered, unfortunately,
I'm sorry.
today, but it just means that there is a lot to learn from you, Tido. Thank you again from Plato to all the partners, Product Board, Amplitude, Full Story, and we are going to do this again with engineering and product leaders. So next one is going to be in 2 weeks with Gautam Prabhu, who is VP of Engineering at PagerDuty, and he was VP of Engineering at Zendesk before. And PagerDuty is doing really, really well with their recent IPO, and there's going to be a lot to learn from Gautam too. Thank you again, the three of you, and I see you around hopefully someday. So thanks again, everyone.
All right. Thanks for joining, everyone.
Fun discussion.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.